Welcome back. I'm Barry Craig. My guest today is the author of Between the Rivers, a socio-historical account of hegemony and heritage. It is in the current issue of Humanity and Society, a national publication of sociologists. He is a professor on our campus, sociology and philosophy. David Nickell, welcome to the program.
Yeah.
Tell us what the article is about to start with.
Well, there are actually 3 articles in there. The first is mine, the original article that I wrote outlining the history of the Between the Rivers area leading up to the formation of land between the lakes and the expulsion of everyone who lived there for that, and going through the entire 5 concepts plan attempts to commercialize the area. And now, with the Forest Service having come in, our efforts to maintain our cultural connection to the place, maintain some feeling among the people that this is still our heritage there. And the Forest Service's attempts really to stop us from doing that.
And you compare and contrast in the journal, or the journal compares and contrast, a situation involving Grenadier Island in the St. Lawrence River in Canada.
Which is the second article, which was written by Michael Bell, who's a professor of sociology at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And he had attended a conference where I presented a paper on this a while back.
And that was in New Mexico?
Yes, Albuquerque, New Mexico. And he had contacted me, and when he discovered that I was writing this article, he wrote the adjoining article, which goes with it, because interestingly, his family, well, I should back up just a little bit.
Sure.
My family and most of the families from Between the Rivers are the descendants of Revolutionary War veterans. Jeremiah Nickell, as well as the descendants of the families all around us in the community I lived in over there, had been given that land as payment for service in the Revolutionary War. Michael Bell's family were Tories. They were loyal to the king and opposed the revolution. So when the Revolutionary War was over, they felt pretty compelled to leave. And they went to Canada, where they were offered, the Canadian government trying to get settlement going at the time, just like they were trying to settle here at the time, gave them land, gave the Tories land to settle. Well, his family settled that land and stayed there for generations, just like ours did. And then, just like ours ended up caught up in the taking of land and turning it into public land in a park, his ancestral home is now inside a national park managed by Parks Canada. The difference was, in dealing with their agency in Canada, they ended up with a completely different outcome than we did. They still own their land, still have a summer home there. It's actually on an island out in the St. Lawrence River.
It's called the Thousand Islands.
Yes, that area is the Thousand Islands area. And one of those islands was where those families had settled.
That's Grenadier Island.
Yes, Grenadier Island. And they still own summer homes there and can go spend the summers there. And there's it's still what's a national park. And there's a heritage program associated with it. And the families are intimately involved in the heritage program. They work very closely with the park officials in determining what's significant about their heritage, their having lived in that place, what ought to be told to the public, how it should be presented, which is very different than what we've got.
That was interesting. We were talking about this earlier. Before the Civil War, a slave named Josiah Henson escaped bondage near Owensboro and took his family into Canada and settled in an area in Ontario near the town of Dresden. And this became a community for escaped American slaves. He was a minister, he was an educator, and so he taught them to read and write, and they farmed. Today, that is also a Canadian park, but the head of the park is his great-great-granddaughter, at least was when he visited there a few years ago. So I wonder if that's a Canadian, that's a philosophy across the board in the Canadian government.
I'm sure it is. Well, I know from Mike's article that there are exceptions. There were places where they didn't have such a good connection, but they ended up with that, and the example you're giving is another one. There are also laws in the United States where land like this, it's now public property, and a group of people have a cultural connection to it from their having lived there for generations or whatever. That land can be declared a traditional cultural property. They can be given what's called consulting party status through the National Heritage Preservation Act. It's called Section 106 review. And all that does is acknowledge that that is their heritage in a way it will never be anyone else's heritage. That they have a relationship to that place that no one else can ever have to it. Now, it's still public land. It's still managed. Being given consulting party status doesn't give you veto power over anything they want to do, but it says they have to consult with you over what is significant from your perspective. Because if your families have lived there for many generations, things may seem significant to you that others wouldn't notice. Where these laws were first came about, or where they're most applied, is like with Native American sites that are on public lands and things now. There could be a hillside where a certain event took place every year, a ceremony or whatever, and there may be nothing there to distinguish it from any surrounding hillside. So for an outsider that comes out there, it's just another hill. To those people, that hill has special significance. And what this does is allow that significance to be taken into account and protected. And what that does then is allow them and their children, their descendants, to continue to have that connection to that place.
Going back to your article, in reading through it, the theory of the land between the lakes, wasn't it sort of like the Smoky Mountains, that this would be, it would be a green magnet was the term used. It would stimulate all of this commercial development, like Gatlinburg and Sevierville, and Pigeon
that
Forge
are outside Smoky Mountains.
But what draws you to Dollywood or to Gatlinburg is the Great Smoky Mountains National Park.
Right.
Was that the theory?
Absolutely.
So in your view, how did they get off the rails from that?
It became inconvenient. We have changes in philosophy, ideologies, to where now we're pushing more towards privatizing public lands. We don't think the public ought to be supporting them. They ought to have to raise their own revenues, which is one of the real concerns. Is one of the resources that is being most utilized now around the country to promote these kind of things and to raise money for them is heritage resources, to bring people into heritage sites. So you promote those to bring in the tourists, which when you look over there now, and the only thing left are cemeteries, over 250 cemeteries that we still maintain ourselves. The government's never maintained those. We look over there and we see our church sites, school sites, all these things that to us are significant, and we don't think they ought to be used for tourism purposes, especially since the land was taken from us on the justification that if it weren't taken, it would be commercialized. If you had the lakes surrounding this area and it were left in private ownership, was the argument, it would be developed just like the surrounding area. And if it were placed in public ownership, it could be protected from that.
But going back, I'm old to remember the early days of LBL. When I used to be a newspaper reporter, going over there back in the 70s, you couldn't buy anything over there. I mean, and the TVA employees had to pack their lunch in or go across the river. There was absolutely no commercialization whatsoever. And it was that the original goal?
The promise they made to us in our homes was that this land, in exchange for us losing all that land, it would be forever free to the public and undeveloped commercially. Got that in affidavits from the people.
So when did that change?
It's been a creeping process. There was some controversy when they first started putting in drink machines and ice machines.
I remember that.
Some of the campgrounds and things. Even that was seen as a violation at the time. It was actually surrounding business owners and things saw it as competition when they started doing that. And then the 5 concepts plan came out to really develop. That contained plans for everything up to golf courses and theme parks, and again, it was going to be a heritage theme park, focusing on the heritage of the place. But they used as argument in courts the only justification for taking that land, and it's kind of a technical argument for this, but the original plan for land between the lakes was for the Park Service to run it. I went, when all this was going on, and asked Harold Van Morgan to sit down and talk with me and explain to me the process, how this worked. And I met with him in his living room, and I asked him why the National Park Service had not followed through with their original plan to develop and run land between the lakes.
Which would have been like the Smoky Mountains.
Yes. And what he explained to me was Barkley Lake was nearly completed. The land values were about to go through the roof. It was going to take the Park Service several years probably to get through Congress the appropriations to do the project, to use eminent domain and purchase all the land. By that point, the land values would have been so high that it would have never passed. But TVA had, under the 1933 TVA Act, the authority to use eminent domain for demonstration purposes. They didn't have to go through the full congressional route to get all their appropriations and their approval. So they could do it right away. So they had to hurry to get this project through so that they could take the land before it became too expensive. Now, I think what the general public doesn't understand was that was the 5th round of eminent domain for the people between the rivers. Like I said, the first wasn't technically eminent domain. It was the Resettlement Administration in the late 30s on the New Deal programs. And it technically wasn't eminent domain, but they were condemning farms, moving people off of them. Shortly after that, TVA came through with the Kentucky Lake Project and condemned all the land along the bottoms in order to build Kentucky Lake, which, of course, people between the rivers thought was an odd thing, that you would permanently flood more land than had ever flooded with the worst of the natural floods, and then call that flood control. Then there was the Barkley Lake Project in the 50s, late 50s, yeah, and they didn't finish that until early 60s, but and they condemned all the land along the other side of that peninsula. The land between the lakes is actually the largest inland peninsula in the United States. They moved everybody off that, had to move everybody out. And of course, most of the people were being moved around were trying the best they could to find land between those rivers, because that's where we'd been all the time and we considered that to be our home. So most people wanted to stay there. And then they came through as a little program most people didn't know about. A new law passed that said when one government agency undertakes an action which harms the property of another government agency, they have to compensate them for it. So the Corps of Engineers, in doing the Barkley Lake project, which was originally a TVA project, but they were getting criticism for moving outside the Tennessee Valley, so they turned that project over to the Corps of Engineers. When they made that flood, they flooded land that was part of the Kentucky Woodlands National Wildlife Refuge, located between the two rivers, which is a whole other story, how that gets there. So the Fish and Wildlife Service that was managing the refuge had already done a study to determine how much land would be flooded and what the impact would be. And I've got a copy of that study that shows they determined that the carrying capacity for wildlife in those river bottoms was very high, but the carrying capacity up on the ridges up along the spine of that peninsula was very low. So they had calculated that it would take 10 to 15 acres of ridgeland to replace every 1 acre of bottomland that was flooded. So rather than just have the Corps of Engineers pay them for the number of acres they flooded, they had to replace the land. Well, they don't make more land, right? Just not there. So the way that they did this was once again use eminent domain to take land from private citizens so that the Corps of Engineers could place that back into the refuge to compensate the Fish and Wildlife Service. Which meant you had people moved numerous times in rapid succession. There were lots of families that their land would be condemned, they would find some place to move into, and you would have to shuffle around, you'd have to try to find some place you could buy, build a home. And when you're talking about moving a farm, that's not an easy thing to do with all the equipment, animals, outbuildings, everything else. It's a lot of effort to move a farm, building fences, everything. And they would just be getting moved in, and the government would show up and condemn their land again, and they'd have to move. And I've heard stories from a lot of people that they would just be getting moved in, their land be condemned, and they would get paid less than what they had just paid for the land. And there were people who had to move 3 and 4 times. Now, that was Resettlement Administration, Kentucky Lake Project, it's the second round of removals, Bartlett Lake, and then replacement for the wildlife refuge is the 4th. And then all that was just getting settled in and people kind of finding a place to live again, and we thought everybody was safe because there's no other direction the water can come from. And then we read in the paper, it wasn't announced ahead of time, it just came out in the paper about the Land Between the Lakes project, which was now going to remove everybody. Was going to take everybody's property, move everybody off in order to create a recreation area. But at this point, you're talking about people that have been in this area that was culturally somewhat insulated from the outside, enough so that from where my family lived, you could travel the 2 or 3 miles up to Grand Rivers, and you had left between the rivers. Even though Grand Rivers is still geographically between the Tennessee and the Cumberland rivers, it was not a between the rivers community. When the ferries, which were the main way to get in and out of that peninsula, would bring people over that were from outside, the ferry operators would ring their bells to let everybody know they're bringing in an outsider. People would hear that and they would start ringing their dinner bells. And before this outsider ever got off that ferry, everybody there would know there was somebody from outside in the community. I mean, we just had this real strong sense of there's insiders and outsiders and this strong sense of ourselves. All of a sudden people were being ripped from that, being forced to move. And this is when a lot of people just dug in their heels and said, no, we're not leaving. Enough's enough. You can understand being forced to move if they're building a lake. But for a recreation area, it didn't make sense. And people just refused.
Had they, and the 5, Concept Zero organizations you're part of, and was obviously because you all felt betrayed that they didn't keep the promise.
Right. Well, again, people don't understand the significance of that.
In other words, would you feel better as a, what, 5th generation?
6th.
6th generation, if they had stuck to it and you couldn't even buy a soda pop over there? Would you feel better about that?
I think not only would I feel better about it, but I think the business owners in the surrounding communities who are selling those drinks, bags of ice, and the supplies that they used to make good livings off of. It used to be when you went into one of the campgrounds, they had a list of businesses on the outside. Mm-hmm. And you could call them and make arrangements to go get them. And now those campgrounds are such competition to the surrounding businesses that it's difficult for them to make a living now. But again, I think people don't understand the significance of that promise, why it matters to us, because we have no economic stake in that. It doesn't cost me a dime that somebody's buying this stuff inside Land Between the Lakes. But I grew up watching people take a principled stand that this is enough, what is being done is wrong, and they knew they couldn't stop it. They knew there was no way to stop it, but it was just wrong and they wouldn't go along with it. And TVA people would show up and do an appraisal of your land, and then mail you a letter telling you how much they had determined your land was worth. And they would give you a date that you had to be gone by. If you weren't gone by that date, they would show up with a bulldozer, push your house down into a pile, set it on fire, and then bury what was left with everything you owned still inside it. There were several people that happened to.
Does the TVA though claim that that never happened?
They just say there are no records of it, and there aren't, because they didn't keep records of this. And one of the things we've run into is we've been talking recently to some documentary filmmakers and different things is, well, we've got to be able to verify these things. I mean, it's not that we don't believe you, we just got to be able to verify.
Sure.
Well, so I was talking to our next door neighbor that lived there, whose home was bulldozed and burned with their things still inside. And I asked him, could you prove that? How would you go about proving that happened to you? Unless you're going to go out there and dig down and find the ashes and try to identify what was there, how would you prove it if there are no official records? I was at a meeting with the new Forest Service archaeologist that had just come in at the time. It's not the one that's there now. When people were talking about with their heritage program, that none of this was mentioned. It says that while there were a few people who resisted or were reluctant to sell, the majority were willing sellers. And we were saying, you know, it's not right. We really did everything we could to try to stay there. And people even, I mean, suffered that kind of indignity to be able to stay. And there are all these stories about, you know, older women being carried out of their sick beds, and their sick beds set up in the yard, and the woman laying in the yard while they pushed the house down and burned it. I mean, these kind of things went on, and there's no official record of it. And this archaeologist finally just pounded his fist on the desk and said, look, I'm tired of hearing those kind of stories from you people. I've read the official records, and none of that ever happened. And I don't think people can understand what it's like to be sitting there in a room full of people who lived through these things, and to have a government official tell you, you're wrong, none of this ever happened. And there just aren't any official records of it. And that's part of the reason I started in on this, trying to record these stories from people. But part of the reason too is because now the government has decided it's going to have its own heritage program. And we already had a heritage program. There is a Between the Rivers organization, Between the Rivers Incorporated, that for years now has been going around and maintaining cemeteries that there's nobody left who's able to maintain them. We've completely restored the one remaining church over there that they didn't destroy. We asked them to leave the churches. They bulldozed and burned those, the ones that couldn't be moved at our expenses. We've been trying to locate and mark all the former church sites, school sites, all these kind of things, record stories. And then the Forest Service has now determined that it's going to have its own heritage program, and it's open to the general public to volunteer to come participate in, and we can come participate in that program with them if we want to. We have no more input into what the heritage is, how it should be understood, how it should be interpreted, what places are important, how it should be promoted to the public, whether or not it can be used for commercial purposes than anybody else in the general public. We've been told explicitly that we were paid for our land, and I keep trying to tell them, you may have bought the land, but you didn't buy the heritage. The heritage is not a fungible property. It is still ours. It still belongs to my children. We're the 7th generation. We're hoping it'll belong to my great-grandchildren, if that ever happens.
Any idea, in your view, why the Canadian situation is different? In other words, why did the Canadians do Grenadier Island the way they did, and then the Americans do LBL the way they did? In talking to your Canadian friend, did you get any input?
This was, one of the purposes of this was to try to identify and speculate really on what the differences were and how the different outcomes might have been. And there are bureaucratic differences. There are a lot of similarities, but there's some differences there. One of the ones Michael Bell speculated on that I think has some merit is in their case, when the Heritage Program was established, they weren't having to deal with the baggage of having taken the land in such a shameful way, of having forced the people off and put them through that. So now there's this bureaucratic inertia, if you will, this sense of we've got to defend what was done. It can't be admitted that if not the LBL project itself, then at least how the LBL project was undertaken was wrong. It never should have happened the way it did. And it's like the government agencies cannot acknowledge that they would do this to the general public, treat people that way.
Well, in other words, how did the LBL get off its original mission? How did the privatization come in? Because I remember, like you said, it began to creep in. I saw a drink machine. I was like,
Right.
wow, I hadn't seen that before. So what was the philosophy behind that?
Just change of managers, change of administrations over time, change of political, the will to publicly fund the place in order to keep it running, the increasing sense that it's wrong for government, for the public to be funding these kind of things, and they should carry their own weight, make their own money.
Isn't there a move all across the national parks?
Yes.
Well, we went out to Grand Canyon, and they're private they're dining areas that they're run under, I guess, franchise of the government. So
Right.
this is part of a philosophy, a big, broad philosophy here.
Yes, and it's still an ongoing thing, and there's opposition to it. There's organizations out there, like the Wild Wilderness organization, has their own website that documents this whole move.
What is that website?
They're actually, it's just Wild Wilderness, all one word, .org.
.org. Okay.
And does a real good job of documenting these things. There are lobbying organizations out there promoting the privatization and the development of these lands. And it's primarily funded and run by the Disney Corporation, the Coleman Coolers, Winnebago Corporation, Honda Motorcycles. There are a lot of these organizations, these companies kind of come together that really want to see this turned over to private business to be run like a business. Mm-hmm. But again, you know, the land, the only justification they had for taking this in court was that if they did not take it from us, that it would be commercialized, that it would be developed. That was not the case on all public lands, but it was for land between the lakes. I mean, we went through the thing, like I've said, of them forcing people out. Most of the people did not stay around and have their homes bulldozed.
I'm going to have to stop you. We can't stay around anymore. We're out of time. We'll come back to this again. And also, in the time we have left, I would invite anyone from the U.S. Forest Service to come over. My number is 270-534-3270, and come on and either talk by themselves, or Professor Nickell, you would come back, I'm sure.
And if anyone would like to just contact me for more information.
Your number is?
270-534-3269.
We're out of time. Thanks for joining us. My guest was David Nickell. We'll see you next time.